Mighty Warriors, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Alicia, and today we're going to discuss an interesting character from the Bible. His name was Jeroboam, and Jeroboam was a king, and he was given the kingdom after God took it away from Solomon and Solomon's family. He split the kingdom and he gave 10 tribes to King Jeroboam, and the other two went to Rehoboam, which was a son of Solomon. And this story, the interesting details around Jeroboam are very, when you dig into them, there's a lot of interesting tidbits. And so I want to kind of talk about that a little bit. The Lord was kind of talking to me, and he was saying, just because you're a believer, that doesn't mean that your children will go that way. And we see that happen a lot in the Bible. Even with David, we see that David had sons, and just because David was a man after God's own heart, his sons didn't necessarily all go that way, and he had many sons, right? And even in the situation with Solomon, he loved the Lord, but he allowed his heart to be pulled away from God by marrying all these various women, right? And so what happened was, because of all of the disobedience, God ripped the kingdom from David's line, and he gave it to Jeroboam. And Jeroboam was sort of like a servant, right? But it was given to him so long as he obeyed. And of course, he did not obey, right? And as you know, Jeroboam became known as one of the wickedest kings that was ever on the throne, right? He did so much evil in the eyes of God. He turned Israel to do evil. And the interesting thing about Jeroboam is that he knew God, right? He actually talked to God, and God was like, I'm going to give you the kingdom as long as you obey, right? And he still disobeyed. And then, even at the end, when he had done all this evil, he had, prevented God's people from going back to Jerusalem to worship the one true God, Yahweh, and instead set up these high places in these groves where there was idol worship, and there was this mixing of the holy and the profane, which is, leading them back to a lot of the stuff that he just delivered them from, right? But then what was really interesting is that when Jeroboam's own son was ill, he goes and he inquires of a prophet of God to see if he will live, right? He sets up all these wicked, priests to serve these groves and to lead the children of Israel astray, while simultaneously knowing who the true God is and inquiring of him for himself. Yeah. So it's very interesting, because when you look at the bloodline of Jeroboam, he was an Ephraimite. And the Ephraimites were descendants of Joseph. So you remember the story of Joseph and how he saved his brothers in Egypt. He was raised up from prison to being the second in command in Egypt. And his part of, when he was brought up, the Pharaoh gave him a wife. And that wife was the daughter of a high priest in Egypt, which means she came from a bloodline that was steeped in idol worship, idolatry, witchcraft, the whole nine, right? And so you see, you have this holy line of Israel, Joseph, from God's chosen people, married to this woman who is like the enemy seed, right? And then has children. And so you can only imagine the influence that this woman had on Joseph's kids, this mixing also of the holy and the profane. And so the irony of this is really not lost on me, because and it could mean nothing, right? But as you see, things come about in Israel, and you see Jeroboam, who is the son of this, the line of Ephraim, it makes you wonder, when the Lord says that the life of a man is in their blood, are we just destined sometimes to do the sins of our fathers, or the sins of our bloodline? And I would say no, right? Because in many instances, God uses people who are not from those bloodlines. So for instance, Ruth was a Moabitess, and she trusted in the God of Naomi, right? But if you know anything about the Moabitesses or the Moabites, you know that they were descendants of Lot. And though Lot was found to be a righteous man, and he was given escape from Sodom and Gomorrah when God destroyed them, his daughters were evil, and they used their father to create children, and they were the mothers of two groups that turned out to be huge enemies of Israel, the Moabites and the Ammonites. And so, it's interesting, because I think the Lord, when he gives us these lineages, he does it for a reason, because he wants us to see sort of how obedience is a choice. We don't have to be a slave to our bloodlines, right? We don't have to be a slave. And how sometimes the people who know God the most, who have the most insight, who have actually talked to God, will make really, really awful decisions. And then how some of them who come from these bloodlines that have a really, really bad reputation will make good decisions, like with Ruth, and when she followed Naomi, and then she was grafted into Jesus's line. You know what I mean? I feel like with these bloodlines, the Lord is telling us that obedience is a choice. We come from these bloodlines that have sin in the past, where people have done things, and we don't have to fall in line with that, right? We can make our own decisions, right? And it's just very interesting to go back and just really listen and really pay attention to the bloodlines, because God doesn't give us those genealogies for no reason. Even with the story of Esther and Haman's genealogy, we see that his lineage goes back to when Saul was supposed to destroy all the Amalekites, and he did not. And that Haman was this descendant, and that there was this deep-seated hatred for Israel. And it all goes back to this, to Saul not doing what God told Saul to do. So interesting that I love to kind of introduce people to this. When you're reading the Bible, pay attention when the Lord tells you in the Bible, who a person is, or who they are descended from, or how, they came to their position. Because there's like little things that he's, like little clues that he's giving you about the character, the family, the way that person might have grown up when you pay attention to those bloodlines, right? In the story of David and Bathsheba, we know that Bathsheba had a grandfather that ended up being a counselor or advisor to, I believe it was Absalom. And that was the son of David who was in his ear. And eventually, Absalom tried to overthrow his father, right? And you have to pay attention to the people that God never leaves anything to chance. When he's telling you these lineages, when he's telling you these names in the Bible and who they are and who they're related to and where they came from and who they were married to, he's telling you something about them. He's telling you information that can help you understand the story a little bit more deeply. And so I wanted to share that with you guys because I know sometimes when you're reading the Bible and he's going through these genealogies, you're like, oh, it's so many names and I can't. But there is information there. There is good information there to kind of tell you, who that is from. Even today, when people say someone is from a certain family, or a certain neighborhood or something, you pay attention to that because you can glean some information from it. Not all, because as I said, we all are individuals and we can choose to be obedient. We have a choice, right? But you can still glean sometimes if there's a certain family and that family has a tendency to do certain things. It gives you a little bit of context is the word. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and let you go with this. But when you're reading the Bible, pay attention to the genealogies. Pay attention to when they tell you who someone's mother was, and investigate further so that your eyes can be opened a little bit more to what God is saying, Because in the Bible, we know that the Bible is really, there's this battle of seeds going on where God's seed and the enemy has planted weeds and they're warring against God's seed. And he talks about this in that parable where the farmer plants good seed and his servant says, they come to him and they're like, but all these tares are being grown in the field. What do you want us to do? The enemy tries to choke out God's seed by planting evil seed. And sometimes you see, as the stories play out in the Bible, how sometimes there is the enemy, you can see the enemy doing something or forcing a situation, that not really forcing it, but introducing a person or tempting someone into a relationship that they probably shouldn't be into. Or in this case where Joseph, he was just given this wife, right? And this was his wife. But she had this really demonic lineage. And so anyway, I just want to encourage you to, when you read the Bible, really investigate those lineages, those names, those backgrounds. It can really open your eyes to some things in the Bible and open your eyes to more information about the person that you're studying, right? So until next time, be baptized and be blessed.